On September 1, 1939, the date Nazi Germany initiated military operations against Poland. Commencing World War II in Europe, George Catlett Marshall Jr. assumed duties as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had selected Marschall Ober 34 officers with greater seniority, a decision that generated significant controversy within military circles. Marshall S. appointment reflected Roosevelt S. assessment that the Army required leadership capable of rapid expansion and modernization should America become involved in the expanding European conflict. The organization Marshall inherited ranked approximately 17th globally in total military strength, according to comparative assessments compiled by the War Department. Active duty personnel totaled approximately 174,000 soldiers, distributed across 130 installations, spanning continental United States territories and overseas possessions. This force structure compared unfavorably with European powers. France maintained approximately 900,000 active people, Britain approximately 680,000, Germany approximately 2.8 million. Following full mobilization, the U.S. Army was numerically smaller than Portugal's, Romania's, and Spain's military establishments. Unit readiness was uniformly poor. Most formations operated at 40 to 60% of authorized strength. Equipment inventories consisted primarily of World War I surplus Springfield, M1903 rifles, Browning M1917, machine guns, French 75mm field guns. The Army possessed fewer than 500 serviceable tanks, mostly obsolete designs from the 1920s. Aviation strength totaled approximately 1,700 aircraft, many unsuitable for modern combat operations. Training standards emphasized garrison duties rather than combat readiness. Officers spent substantial time on administrative functions, personnel management, property accountability, post maintenance. Large-scale tactical exercises were infrequent. Combined arms operations coordinating infantry, artillery, and armor were rarely practiced. The force resembled a constabulary organization, maintaining domestic order rather than a combat army prepared for modern warfare. Marshall possessed unique qualifications for transforming this organization. He had served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France during World War I, initially as operations officer for the 1st Infantry Division, later as Chief of Operations for 1st Army. In these staff positions, Marshall planned major operations, including the Muzargan Offensive of September-November 1980, which involved coordinating movement of more than 600,000 soldiers, the largest American military operation to that date. Marshall's wartime observations shaped his understanding of modern combat requirements. He had witnessed American units suffer disproportionate casualties during frontal assaults against prepared German positions, particularly during operations where inadequate planning and poor coordination resulted in formations attacking piecemeal without proper artillery support. He had observed how rigid adherence to predetermined plans became counterproductive when battlefield conditions changed more rapidly than orders could be modified and transmitted. He understood that future conflicts would be even more fluid and complex, requiring decentralized decision-making and officer initiative, architected systematic chapter expansion, maintaining documentary authenticity and source. The user wants me to continue with the full script. I need to create Chapter 2 about Fort Benning reforms. Let me continue developing the chapters systematically while maintaining the documentary tone and completely rephrasing the source material. Marshall's doctrinal foundation had been established during his previous assignment as Assistant Commandant of the Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia, serving from November 1927 through June 1932. During this 54-month period, Marshall fundamentally restructured how the United States Army trained infantry officers, establishing principles that would shape American tactical doctrine through World War II and beyond. Fort Benning, established in 1980 near Columbus, Georgia, served as the Army's primary infantry training installation. The facility encompassed approximately 97,000 acres of varied terrain suitable for tactical training. When Marshall arrived, the infantry school's curriculum followed traditional military educational methodology: extensive classroom instruction on regulations, detailed problem sets requiring written solutions, and emphasis on procedural knowledge. Marshall implemented radical changes based on his conviction that future wars would require officers capable of rapid decision-making with incomplete information rather than perfect planning with comprehensive intelligence. He directed instructors to eliminate complex formal tactical problems that allowed students days to prepare elaborate solutions. Instead, he substituted simple practical exercises requiring immediate decisions based on minimal information. According to infantry school records, Marshall personally reviewed all instructional materials and modified approximately 70% of existing course content during his first year. He told faculty that the objective was teaching officers how to think rather than what to think, a fundamental distinction. Officers needed to develop judgment and initiative, not memorize procedures. The revised curriculum emphasized exercises where no perfect solution existed. Students received fragmentary information about hypothetical tactical situations. Your platoon occupies this position. Enemy forces are reported approaching from that direction and were required to issue verbal orders within 5 minutes. Instructors evaluated speed of decision-making, clarity of communication, and tactical soundness, rather than perfect adherence to doctrinal procedures. Marshall's most significant innovation was the tactical walk, a practical exercise conducted in field terrain. Small groups of officers would move through training areas with an instructor. At unexpected moments, the instructor would halt the group, describe a tactical situation, and require one student to immediately issue orders for an imaginary unit. The student had no time to study maps, consult references, or deliberate. He had to assess terrain, determine a course of action, and communicate orders all within minutes. These exercises deliberately created stress and uncertainty, mirroring combat conditions. Officers learned they would never possess complete information, adequate time, or ideal circumstances. They had to act decisively despite uncertainty. Marshall believed this psychological conditioning was more valuable than technical knowledge. An officer who could make a sound decision quickly was more valuable than one who could make a perfect decision slowly, because in combat, the slow decision came too late. Marshall also revolutionized officer evaluation methodology. Traditional military education emphasized written examinations, testing, regulatory knowledge. Students who could quote field manuals verbatim received high ratings. Marshall's system evaluated practical performance. Students who demonstrated sound tactical judgment, clear communication, and leadership presence received high ratings, even if their procedural knowledge was imperfect. This represented a fundamental shift from measuring what officers knew to measuring what they could do. The training reform's broader impact derived from Marshall's selection and development of instructors. He recruited officers who shared his vision of mobile, aggressive warfare and trained them to implement his educational philosophy. These instructors then spread throughout the Army as they completed their Fort Benning assignments, carrying Marshall's methods to other installations. By the late 1930s, officer training across multiple facilities reflected Marshall's emphasis on initiative and rapid decision. Approximately 200 officers, who later attained general officer rank, passed through Fort Benning during Marshall's tenure, either as students or instructors. This included Omar N. Bradley, J. Lawton, Collins, Matthew B. Ridgway, Joseph W. Stilwell, Walter Bedell Smith, and numerous others who would command divisions, corps, and armies. During World War II, these officers absorbed Marshall's tactical philosophy and implemented it when they assumed command positions. Marshall's tactical philosophy centered on offensive action as the fundamental principle of warfare. Defense, in Marshall's conception, was inherently temporary, used to economize forces in one sector while attacking in another, or to gain time before resuming offensive operations. When defending, units should conduct aggressive counterattacks to disrupt enemy attacks and recapture lost ground rather than passively holding positions. This emphasis derived from Marshall's analysis of World War I combat patterns. He had observed that German forces were most vulnerable immediately following successful attacks, during the brief period after German units seized American positions, but before they could consolidate gains, bring forward reserves, and establish defensive organization. They were disorganized, low on ammunition, and uncertain about American strength. If American forces counterattacked during this window, typically 15 to 30 minutes after losing a position, they could often retake ground with relatively modest casualties. However, if American commanders waited to gather more information, coordinate with adjacent units, or request reinforcements before German forces would establish defensive positions, emplace machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, and prepare for the counterattack. What could have been retaken in minutes, with a platoon required hours of fighting with a company or battalion, resulting in substantially higher casualties for inferior results. Marshall emphasized to Fort Benning students that immediate counterattack even, with inadequate forces and incomplete information, was almost always preferable to delayed counterattack with superior forces and better coordination. The psychological impact of immediate counterattack disrupted enemy forces before they could consolidate. Delay allowed enemies to strengthen positions geometrically as each minute passed. This doctrine required different officer training than other armies provided. Most military establishments trained officers to await orders from higher headquarters before taking significant action. Marshall trained officers to assess situations independently and act without explicit authorization. A lieutenant commanding a platoon who observed enemy forces massing for attack should call for artillery fire and reposition his unit without requesting permission. A captain commanding a company who identified an exposed enemy flank should immediately attack without coordinating with adjacent units or notifying battalion headquarters. This decentralized approach violated traditional military hierarchy where junior officers executed orders rather than making independent tactical decisions. Marshall argued that modern warfare's pace made centralized control impractical. Communications would fail, situations would change faster than orders could be transmitted, and opportunities would disappear before higher headquarters could assess them. Victory would go to armies whose junior leaders could act decisively without waiting for permission. Marshall also emphasized that officers should focus on the commander's intent rather than specific orders. If a battalion received orders to attack a specific objective, company commanders should understand the battalion commander's purpose, perhaps to seize key terrain controlling approaches to a town. If circumstances changed, perhaps enemy forces abandoned the original objective company, commanders should adapt their actions to fulfill the intent rather than mechanically following obsolete orders. This concept, now standard in American military doctrine as mission-type orders, was revolutionary in the 1930s. It required trusting junior officers to exercise judgment rather than simply following instructions. It meant senior commanders had to accept that subordinates might take actions differing from what the senior commander would have done. It demanded cultural change throughout the organization. When Marshall became Chief of Staff in September 1939, his first priority involved identifying and promoting officers who shared his vision of mobile offensive warfare. He implemented systematic officer evaluation, forcing retirement or reassignment of approximately 600 officers he deemed unsuitable for modern combat command. This included multiple general officers, numerous colonels, and senior staff officers who had spent decades in the Army. Critics accused Marshall of destroying institutional knowledge. Marshall believed he was preventing those officers from commanding soldiers in combat where their outdated thinking would result in unnecessary casualties. The officers Marshall promoted to command positions were typically younger, more aggressive, and more willing to challenge conventional approaches. These included George S. Patton Jr., who shared Marshall's conviction that speed and offensive action were decisive. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who demonstrated ability to coordinate complex operations across services and nationalities, and Jacob L. Devers, who advocated mechanization and modernization. These officers would implement Marshall's offensive doctrine during wartime operations. Marshall's second priority involved large-scale training exercises, testing whether doctrinal concepts would function at division and corps scale. In 1940 and 1941, the United States Army conducted extensive maneuvers across Louisiana and eastern Texas. The Louisiana maneuvers, as they became known, represented the largest peacetime military exercises in American history. According to War Department records, peak participation exceeded 470,000 soldiers organized into multiple provisional armies, conducting realistic combat operations against each other. The exercises covered approximately 3,400 square miles of varied terrain, including forests, swamps, agricultural areas, and small towns. Participating units represented most active Army divisions, plus mobilized National Guard formations. The maneuvers were structured as free-play exercises, where opposing forces, Red Army and Blue Army, fought each other using available equipment and tactics without predetermined outcomes. Umpires observed operations, assessed results of engagements, and determined casualties and equipment losses based on tactical situations. Logistics support for the maneuvers created temporary infrastructure rivaling small cities. Supply depots, maintenance facilities, medical stations, and communications networks were established throughout the maneuver area. Local communities hosted command posts, provided billeting for some units, and adapted to having hundreds of thousands of soldiers operating in their region. The Louisiana economy experienced unprecedented activity as the military purchased supplies and services. Marshall attended the Louisiana maneuvers personally, observing operations and evaluating performance. He was testing specific questions. Could large formations move rapidly while maintaining cohesion? Could junior officers make independent decisions without awaiting detailed orders? Could units adapt to changing situations? Could offensive operations be sustained over extended periods? The answers would determine whether Marshall's doctrinal concepts were practical at scale. Results confirmed Marshall's expectations. Units that moved aggressively and counterattacked immediately when attacked achieved better outcomes than units that established defensive positions and waited for reinforcements. Officers who took initiative without awaiting explicit orders from higher headquarters were more successful than those who adhered rigidly to plans. Small mobile formations that maneuvered against enemy flanks and rear areas created disproportionate disruption compared to larger formations conducting frontal attacks. One notable performer was Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, serving as Chief of Staff for Third Army during the maneuvers. Eisenhower's planning enabled his force to conduct rapid movements that confused opposing forces. He demonstrated understanding of how mechanized forces could exploit breakthrough and penetrate deeply into enemy rear areas before defenders could react. Marshall observed Eisenhower's performance and noted him for future advancement. Eisenhower would rise from lieutenant colonel to 4-star general in less than 3 years. Another officer who distinguished himself was Brigadier General George Patton, commanding an armored division. Patton pushed his units beyond doctrinal movement rates, advancing faster and farther than opposing forces anticipated. He ignored some maneuver boundaries, arguing that realistic training required treating the exercise as actual combat without artificial constraints. While umpires criticized these violations, Marshall recognized Patton's aggressive spirit as exactly what American commanders would need in wartime. The maneuvers also revealed deficiencies requiring correction. American logistics systems struggled to support rapidly moving formations. Supply units could not track fast-moving combat units, resulting in fuel and ammunition shortages. Communications systems where unreliable radio networks frequently failed. Messages were lost or garbled, and coordination between units broke down. Artillery-infantry coordination was poor, with supporting fires arriving late or hitting incorrect locations. However, these were correctable problems. Better logistics procedures, improved communications equipment, and refined coordination techniques could address them. The fundamental tactical concepts proved sound. Offensive action achieved results. Decentralized decision-making enabled rapid adaptation. Initiative by junior leaders created opportunities. American doctrine was validated. It needed refinement, but not fundamental revision. By December 1941, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States, the Army had expanded to approximately 1.64 million personnel. More significantly, those soldiers were being trained according to doctrinal principles Marshall had developed at Fort Benning and validated during the Louisiana maneuvers. The doctrine was formally codified in Field Manual 100-5 Operations, published in May 1941. FM 100-5 represented official Army doctrine, applicable to all units. The manual explicitly stated that offense was the decisive form of warfare. According to the manual, defensive operations were inherently temporary measures employed to economize forces in one area, while attacking in another, or to gain time before resuming offensive operations. The manual emphasized that even when conducting defensive operations, commanders should seek opportunities for counterattack to disrupt enemy operations and regain lost ground. The manual's tactical guidance emphasized several key principles. Initiative belonged to commanders who acted aggressively. Waiting for perfect conditions meant losing opportunities. Rapid exploitation of success was more important than consolidating gains. Commanders at all levels should understand their superior's intent and act to fulfill that intent, even when specific orders became outdated or impossible to execute. This doctrinal approach differed fundamentally from other Allied armies' approaches. British Army doctrine, reflecting lessons from World War I, emphasized establishing strong defensive positions with mutually supporting fields of fire. When attacked, British forces would hold ground, request artillery support, and organized deliberate counterattacks only after assessing the situation and assembling adequate forces with proper preparation. This methodical approach prioritized minimizing casualties through careful planning. French military doctrine similarly emphasized defense through firepower. French forces would establish positions in depth, channeling attackers into killing zones covered by concentrated artillery and machine gun fire. French counterattacks followed detailed planning with overwhelming firepower preparation. The emphasis was on methodical operations, with thorough coordination rather than rapid response. Soviet doctrine differed, but also emphasized mass and central control. Red Army offensive operations involved massive artillery preparations, barrages, lasting hours or days followed by attacks with overwhelming force concentrated at decisive points. Soviet counterattacks similarly involved thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Moving according to detailed plans coordinated at army or front level, initiative rested with higher headquarters rather than units in contact. American doctrine was unique in emphasizing immediate action by forces in contact. If a platoon was attacked, the platoon leader, a lieutenant or sergeant, was expected to counterattack immediately with available forces without awaiting orders from company headquarters. If a company position was penetrated, the company commander or captain should organize immediate counterattack without waiting for battalion coordination. The emphasis was on speed of response rather than perfect coordination. This approach required different soldiers than other armies produced. American training created soldiers who could think independently, understand intent rather than just following orders, and adapt to unexpected situations without awaiting guidance. This was not natural. It required systematic training from initial entry through advanced courses. Infantry replacement training centers across the United States implemented 13-week basic training programs for recruits entering the Army. According to training command records, the curriculum allocated substantial time to battle drills, emphasizing aggressive action. Standard drills included reacting to ambush, assaulting fortified positions, conducting hasty attacks, clearing buildings, and responding to indirect fire. Every drill emphasized immediate offensive action as the default response. The training was intentionally physically exhausting and mentally demanding. Trainees would complete forced marches covering 20 to 25 miles while carrying full equipment, then immediately assault objectives without rest. They would dig defensive positions, occupy them briefly, then receive orders to abandon positions and attack in a different direction. The purpose was teaching soldiers there would never be adequate time, perfect conditions, or ideal preparation. They had to act with whatever they had whenever opportunities appeared. Officer training at Infantry Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning was even more intensive. The OCS program compressed approximately 4 years of military education into a 17-week course, according to school records. Candidates underwent continuous evaluation of decision-making ability under pressure, leadership in realistic tactical exercises, and adaptation to unexpected tactical situations. Instructors deliberately created no-win scenarios where no perfect solution existed. Candidates received fragmentary information, faced tight time limits, and had to make decisions with inadequate resources. The training objective was producing officers who would take initiative and accept risk rather than waiting for guidance. Better to make an acceptable decision immediately than a perfect decision too late, because in combat, late decisions accomplished nothing. This training philosophy created a distinctive American tactical culture. Junior leaders at all levels were expected to demonstrate initiative. A lieutenant identifying an opportunity to attack should do so even if it meant deviating from the original plan. A captain discovering enemy flanks exposed should attack immediately rather than reporting to battalion and awaiting orders. This culture was reinforced through personnel policies. Officers showing initiative and achieving results received rapid promotion regardless of seniority. Officers avoiding risk and awaiting orders were relieved. The first significant test of American doctrine against German forces occurred in North Africa during February 1943. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, fought between February 14th to 24th, 1943, in Tunisia, represented the initial major engagement between American and German ground forces during World War II. German armor, commanded by General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, attacked American positions on February 14th, achieving complete tactical surprise. American units, the majority experiencing their first combat, were driven back approximately 50 miles. By February 20th, American forces had suffered more than 6,000 casualties, including approximately 3,000 missing or captured. Equipment losses were substantial, and unit cohesion had deteriorated in multiple sectors. British commanders anticipated American forces would withdraw, consolidate, and prepare deliberate counter-offensive operations, standard British practice following defeats of this magnitude. British doctrine called for taking time to assess failures, reorganize units, integrate replacements, and plan subsequent operations carefully to prevent repeating mistakes. American forces responded differently. Within 24 hours of peak fighting, American artillery units that had retreated were back in firing positions, supporting infantry. Tank units were refueling, rearming, and preparing to infantry regiments that had been scattered were reforming and moving toward enemy positions. By February 22nd, just 3 days after the German assault, peaked American counterattacks had halted the German advance. By February 24th, American forces had recaptured lost territory. German forces withdrew, failing to achieve operational objectives. British commanders were simultaneously impressed by American resilience and concerned by what appeared as hasty, poorly coordinated operations. British doctrine suggested weeks were necessary to recover from defeats like Kasserine Pass. Americans recovered in days, immediately resuming offensive operations. General Sir Harold Alexander, the British officer, assuming overall command in North Africa after Kasserine Pass, attempted to impose more methodical operational tempo on American forces. He advocated additional training and deliberate operations. However, American commanders, particularly Major General George S. Patton, Jr., who assumed command of the Second Corps after Kasserine, insisted on immediate offensive action. Patton's guidance to subordinates emphasized that defeating enemy forces required attacking immediately, making enemies react to American initiatives rather than allowing them to plan their own operations. Within a month, American forces achieved clear tactical victory at the Battle of El Gedder, March 23, 1943, their first significant success against Wehrmacht forces. The aggressive doctrine was functioning effectively. By December 1944, American tactical doctrine had been refined through campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, following the Normandy invasion of June 6, 1944. Junior officers throughout the Army understood they were expected to take initiative. Soldiers at all levels knew immediate counterattack was the standard response to enemy attacks. The culture of aggressive offense had become deeply embedded. On December 16, 1944, at 0530 hours, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, their largest offensive in the West since 1940. The attack involved approximately 30 divisions, totaling approximately 250,000 personnel, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise along an 85-mile front, stretching through the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. Weather conditions favored German operations. Heavy snowfall, sub-freezing temperatures, and dense fog grounded Allied tactical aircraft that had dominated the battlefield since Normandy. Visibility was limited to a few hundred meters. German armor advanced rapidly through thinly held American positions. Several American units broke and retreated. Others were surrounded and destroyed. Within 48 hours, German forces had created a salient approximately 50 miles deep in the Allied front, the Bulge, giving the battle its common name. The situation appeared catastrophic by conventional military assessment. American forces were scattered and retreating. German armor was advancing toward the Meuse River and the critical port of Antwerp. If German forces reached Antwerp, they would split Allied armies and potentially force negotiations, allowing Germany to continue the war, or whatever. Three developments occurred that German planners had not anticipated based on their experience with other Allied forces. First, small American units throughout the Ardennes immediately began conducting local counterattacks, despite being outnumbered, surrounded, or bypassed. At numerous crossroads and villages, American forces that conventional doctrine would expect to surrender or withdraw instead attacked German forces. These small unit actions, often platoon or company-scale counterattacks against battalion or regimental size, German formations accomplished little tactically. Most failed to recapture lost positions. However, They achieved significant operational effects by forcing German units to deploy from march columns into combat formations, delay advances while dealing with unexpected resistance, and consume time that German operational plans had not allocated for clearing bypassed positions. The cumulative effect of hundreds of small, often unsuccessful counterattacks was disrupting the German operational timeline. The offensive plan required reaching the Meuse River within 48 to 72 hours. Small unit American counterattacks delayed German advances sufficiently that operational objectives became unachievable according to schedule. The second unexpected development involved American senior commanders immediately organizing large-scale counteroffensives without waiting for complete situation assessment. Within 24 hours of initial German attacks, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was redirecting entire divisions toward the breakthrough area Nord to establish defensive positions. On December 19, 1944, Eisenhower convened a commanders' conference at Verdun, France, beginning at 1100 hours. Attendees included Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers, commanding 6th Army Group, Lieutenant General George S. Petain, Jr., commanding 3rd Army, and senior staff officers from SHAEF Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. According to conference records documented in multiple participants' post-war accounts, Eisenhower opened by characterizing the situation as opportunity rather than disaster. German forces had abandoned fortified positions and could be engaged in mobile operations where American advantages in artillery, air power, and logistics would be decisive. He directed immediate counterattack operations. Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly 3rd Army could attack northward into the German southern flank. Patton stated he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The response generated skepticism among British and some American officers present. 3rd Army was positioned approximately 100 miles south of the breakthrough area, fully engaged in offensive operations toward the German frontier in the Saar region. Reorienting an entire army required disengaging from current operations, turning all units 90 degrees north, repositioning artillery, rerouting supply lines, and coordinating with adjacent Allied forces. British and German military planners estimated such a maneuver would require at least 2 weeks, possibly a month. Moving an entire army required extensive planning, detailed logistics coordination, and methodical execution. Conventional military wisdom held that armies could not simply reorient 90 degrees and attack in 48 hours. It was operationally impossible. However, Patton had anticipated this requirement before departing for Verdun. He had directed his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for turning north, codenamed Nickel, Dime, and Cent, corresponding to different axes of advance. When Eisenhower gave the order, Patton's staff executed previously prepared plans. Eisenhower, recognizing the complexity, gave Patton 72 hours instead of 48, ordering attack commencement on December 22nd. Executing even prepared plans required extraordinary coordination. 3rd Army staff officers worked continuously, issuing movement orders. Regimental commanders disengaged from current operations while still in contact with enemy forces. Battalion commanders organized units for movement while conducting combat operations. Company commanders rerouted supply convoys independently. Artillery units displaced weapons, moved north, and prepared to support the counter. Nobody awaited detailed orders explaining exactly what to do. They understood the mission: attack north, and determined execution details themselves. This exemplified Marshall's training doctrine. Junior leaders executing complex operations without detailed direction from higher headquarters. Officers understanding commanders' intent and adapting actions accordingly. Speed of execution prioritized over perfect coordination. At 06:30 hours on December 22 in 8 66 hours after the Verdun Conference, 3 divisions of 3rd Army attacked north into the German southern flank. The 4th Armored Division led the advance, driving toward Bastogne, where American forces had been surrounded since December 20th. The defense of Bastogne itself demonstrated American tactical doctrine in practice. The town controlled 7 roads, converging from multiple directions. Control of Bastogne meant control of movement throughout the region. German forces required these roads for their offensive. Capturing Bastogne was operationally essential. American forces defending Bastogne included the 101st Airborne Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, and various supporting units. Total strength, approximately 15,000 personnel. They were surrounded by 7 German divisions totaling more than 45,000 soldiers supported by heavy armor and artillery. Conventional military doctrine suggested surrounded forces should establish defensive perimeters and conserve resources while awaiting relief. American forces at Bastogne did the opposite. They attacked continuously. Throughout the siege, American units conducted sustained offensive operations. When German forces probed defensive perimeters, American units did not merely repel attacks, they counterattacked to push Germans back and inflict casualties. When German artillery positions were identified, American forces organized raids to attack them. When German infantry attempted infiltration, American patrols hunted them. This aggressive defensive approach was practiced by units throughout the Bastogne perimeter. When German forces threatened American lines, immediate counterattack was the invariable response. On December 23rd, German infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division penetrated American positions near Marvy village on the southeastern perimeter. The penetration threatened to split American defenses and allow German armor to enter Bastogne from the east. Team O'Hara, from Combat Command B, 10th Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara, immediately counterattacked without awaiting orders from higher headquarters or assessing German strength. The team included M4 Sherma medium tanks, M5 Stuart light tanks, M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, armored infantry in M3 half-tracks, and engineer support. They attacked immediately while German forces were consolidating their penetration. The counterattack struck German infantry before they could establish defensive positions. American tanks overran German positions. Armored infantry dismounted and cleared buildings. Engineers destroyed German strongpoints with demolition. Within 2 hours, American forces had restored the original defensive line. Similar actions occurred throughout the perimeter. Immediate counterattacks, preventing German forces from consolidating any gains. American artillery at Bastogne was employed aggressively, consistent with doctrine emphasizing massing fires quickly and shifting targets rapidly. When German forces were observed concentrating for attacks, American artillery engaged them before assaults could develop. When German infantry attacked American positions, artillery fired extremely close to American lines, sometimes within 100 meters, close enough that shell fragments occasionally wounded American soldiers. This danger-close fire support was acceptable doctrine. Better to accept some friendly casualties from own artillery than be overrun by enemy infantry. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, colored, equipped with 155 mm howitzers, provided sustained fire support throughout the siege. According to battalion records, they fired more than 10,000 rounds during the siege, frequently at danger-close ranges. Battery commanders made independent targeting decisions without awaiting approval from higher headquarters, enabling artillery to respond immediately to infantry requests. American armor operated aggressively rather than defending static positions. Tank commanders conducted aggressive patrols, engaged German forces at long range, and repositioned constantly to prevent German forces from determining American tank locations. This mobile defense consumed more fuel and wore out equipment faster than static defense, but was more effective at disrupting German operations. The aggressive tactics succeeded because American soldiers at all levels had been trained to think offensively. A private manning a machine gun did not merely defend his position, he looked for opportunities to attack German positions with fire. A sergeant commanding a squad organized patrols to raid German positions rather than just holding his defensive sector. A lieutenant commanding a platoon assessed situations and took action based on understanding Commander-S intent, rather than awaiting specific orders. This tactical culture directly resulted from training emphasizing initiative at all levels, from basic training, through advanced courses, through unit training. Soldiers learned they were expected to act, rather than merely follow orders. When circumstances changed, soldiers adapted without awaiting new orders. When opportunities appeared, soldiers exploited them without requesting permission. The siege was lifted on December 26, 1944, when elements of the 4th Armored Division, spearheading 3rd Army's counterattack, reached Bastogne. First, Lieutenant Charles P. Bogus, commanding a platoon from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, led the breakthrough. His lead tank, an M4A3E, two Sherman Jumbo assault tank nicknamed Cobra King, entered Bastogne at approximately 1650 hours. The relief corridor was narrow, only a few hundred meters wide, immediately came under German fire as enemy forces attempted to cut it. However, it was sufficient. Supplies and reinforcements could reach defenders. But relief did not mean fighting ceased. American forces immediately transitioned from defense to offense. Units that had defended the perimeter for 6 days began attacking outward to expand the corridor and push German forces back. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been surrounded and under sustained attack, was conducting offensive operations by December 27th. This immediate transition from desperate defense to offense shocked German commanders, who expected forces surviving such ordeals would require days or weeks to recover before resuming combat operations. After Germany's surrender in May 9, the United States Army conducted extensive operational analysis, examining combat performance. The analyses, documented in after-action reports and historical studies, confirmed Marshall's doctrinal principles. Aggressive, continuous offensive action achieved objectives faster and often with lower cumulative casualties than cautious, methodical approaches. Training, emphasizing initiative and speed, produced more effective combat units. Doctrine, pushing decision-making to lowest practical levels, created more flexible and responsive forces. These lessons became permanently embedded in American military doctrine. They remained core principles through subsequent conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Modern infantry field manuals continue teaching that optimal response to ambush is immediate assault through the ambush position. Modern officer training continues, emphasizing rapid decision-making with incomplete information rather than waiting for perfect knowledge. The defense of Bastogne in December 1944 was not accident or fortunate circumstances. It was a direct result of systematic doctrinal development, consistent training, and cultural change within the United States. Armies spanning 2 decades, from Marshall-S Fort Benning reforms through wartime application, soldiers at Bastogne fought exactly as they had been trained when surrounded. They attacked. When offered surrender, they refused. When relieved, they immediately resumed offensive operations. This was not recklessness, but doctrine consistently applied. The fundamental difference between American and Allied tactical approaches derived from different answers to a basic question. When your forces are attacked, what do you do? British doctrine emphasized establishing strong positions, requesting support, clarifying situations, then launching carefully planned counterattacks with adequate forces and preparation. Soviet doctrine emphasized massing overwhelming force, coordinating with higher headquarters, preparing with massive artillery, then attacking with numerical superiority. American doctrine emphasized immediate counterattack with available forces before enemies could consolidate positions. All three approaches could succeed in appropriate circumstances. However, American doctrine was consistently faster. In mobile warfare against skilled opponents with limited resources, speed often mattered more than perfect preparation. German commanders who fought American forces for 2 years consistently noted in reports that Americans were most difficult opponents because they never stopped attacking. When defeated, Americans immediately counterattacked. When defenses were prepared, Americans attacked before preparations completed. When attempting to rest, Americans maintained pressure. This operational approach was enabled by 3 American advantages: industrial production supplying vast ammunition, fuel, and equipment quantities, large population base providing replacements, and training systems producing soldiers and officers capable of executing complex operations independently without detailed higher headquarters direction. Marshall understood these factors when designing American tactical doctrine, creating systems exploiting American advantages through continuous aggressive offensive action, consuming resources but maintaining constant enemy pressure. General Anthony C. McAuliffe, commanding at Bastogne, retired as lieutenant general in 1956. When asked about his famous response, he consistently stated it came naturally. Germans expected Americans considering surrender. Americans were considering how to kill more Germans. This attitude difference derived from training and doctrine emphasizing offensive action regardless of circumstances. The principles remain simple: seize initiative, maintain offensive action, counterattack immediately when attacked, empowered junior leaders to act without orders, accept risk and uncertainty as combat inherent characteristics. Speed and aggression can overcome superior enemy numbers or positions. These principles saved Bastogne, won the Battle of the Bulge, contributed significantly to Allied victory in Europe, and remain central to American military doctrine 80 years later.